may get destroyed, get lost that way, so the fluorescence is reduced, and if the molecules are brought closer together by bending at the hinge, the fluorescence is there reduced. And a change of this fluorescence has been observed, indicating bending at the hinge. Now, there are two phenomena that are not explained yet on this. I'm not going to spend much time on them. The next overhead, please, shows an observation by Paul Edman in Sweden that the force velocity curve, as determined by A.V. Hill, was part of a rectangular hyperbola. But Edman found that in this region, which is rather difficult to investigate, of slow shortening near the maximum tension, the speed of shortening is much less than would be expected by Hill's formula. And the next slide, another phenomenon by Lombardi. Oh, the next overhead, sorry. Phenomenon found by Lombardi in Florence, performing these shortening steps, but doing them in two stages. And when the two stages of the step, the length change, are within a couple of milliseconds, the bit after the recovery is very similar to what it would have been if the whole step had been made in one. And but then when you allow a bigger time interval of 10 milliseconds or so between the two parts of this step, there's actually substantially more recovery, quite unexpected. Now, these two phenomena, they're still puzzling, but they're puzzling in a different way from many other things. That's to say, there are too many explanations already available. For this one, there are 3 different explanations already in print, and for the other one, there are 2 in print, and I have in mind a third. But they are still puzzles. Well, now, we've been told in other contexts this evening about great surprises that have happened, unpredictable things. And 10 years ago, I would have said that it was totally impossible to record the tension produced by a single myosin molecule pulling. But this has now become a routine procedure in many laboratories. First done, next slide please, by Spudic and collaborators at Stanford. This is a diagram of their technique. 2 beads with stuck between them a bit of actin filament, and these beads are held in light traps. That's to say, it's a focus of a laser beam, a very high intensity focus, and when light is refracted coming through this beam, the momentum of the quantum may be transferred to the bead, and the net effect of this light being focused is that this traps the bead at this position, and then you move the focus a bit by deflecting the light, and you move the bead. And then there are myosin molecules stuck on another bead here. You move these light traps down until the myosin hits one of these, and you record the response. And next slide shows the responses that they recorded. This was published in 1994, just 5 years ago. And first look at this with a very low concentration of ATP, so that there's a long delay between an attachment happening and the beads being deflected by the myosin attaching, and there's a relatively long period before ATP gets at it and causes it to dissociate. With higher concentrations of ATP, these peaks are very much shorter in duration. And forces produced are of the order of a few piconewtons, a very small amount, and the amount of the linear displacement a few nanometers. Well, this kind of technique is extremely powerful and is one of the very promising things for the future, but at present it has serious limitations. Time resolution is not nearly as good as one would like, and not nearly as good as one gets with single fibers. And the results from different laboratories are very different as regards force, results range between an average of about 2 piconewtons and averages of 10 piconewtons as regards the amount of shortening produced by a single attachment, ranging between about 5 and 15 nanometers. Well, just this year, several new complications have come up. Next overhead, please. This is from a paper in Nature only a few months ago. A group in York, in England, doing this type of experiment, not with myosin from a muscle, but with one of the very slow myosins from other sources like the brush border. And here are these attachments, but you see that there's an additional step at the middle of somewhere in the middle of the attachment. So the force is generated in 2 steps. Now, this has not yet been observed with skeletal muscle myosin. This is on a very much faster time scale, but perhaps it happens, but happens so fast. If it happens within a millisecond, it would not be detected by present techniques. So we hope somebody will do this kind of experiment with a slower muscle myosin. And yes, further X-ray structures have been found. And another one, it's long been known that X-ray diffraction from muscle shows very little from the actin helix, unless the muscle is in rigor, when myosins are attached to the actin helix along the helical structure. And it then shows up. But during contraction, there's almost no accentuation of these layer lines. But recent observations, indeed, just in the most recent issue of the Biophysical Journal by 2 Russians with collaborators in Britain and in Italy, Bershitsky and Tsaturyan, looking, next overhead please, with temperature jumps. Temperature is suddenly raised by several degrees at this point, as is a skinned muscle fiber already fully activated. The tension rises over a period of some tens of milliseconds, much slower than the response to a sudden release here. You see the quick early recovery. And they show that this is not due to additional myosin heads being attached. There's no change of stiffness, but they do find an increase in these actin layer lines in the diffraction pattern. So this must be cross bridges already attached, going from a state in which they are not aligned with the helix, they must be attached or they wouldn't develop force, to another state in which they develop a bit more force and are in line with the actin helix. And the next overhead shows what this is suggesting. This is still very, very hypothetical. We developed this idea in conversation between myself and these 2 Russians, that the rapid recovery of force after a release might be this change, the lever arm tilting against this hinge point within the myosin head without the catalytic domain altering its position, but going from a state here where it can rotate around the axis of the helix, the actin, so that it does not follow the helix, to a state here where it's tilted further so that it develops more tension, but it's attached here rigidly in 3 dimensions so that it does follow the actin. Well, I think there are many surprises in store for us. Now I'm running out of time, so I'll skip on. Next slide. Next overhead. Well, that's a dye that's just begun to be used an article in the last issue of Nature, but one, a week and a half ago, a dye which can be attached at the two ends to SH groups introduced to a myosin molecule by site-directed mutation, so that the axis of the dye relative to the myosin molecule is known precisely, and this is a very powerful method, but the results are not yet published, so we don't know what's going to come. Next overhead, please. Now, this is from a review that I wrote in 1970. Well, I gave a lecture in 73, and it's a list of unknowns, even if, well, the general outlines known at that time were correct. And, well, which structure is the elastic element? What's the nature of this elasticity? Is it rubbery or normal? What structure does the stepwise change? Is the attachment to a single actin? It's now fairly clear that it does attach to two. What kinds of bonds? Well, there are certainly electrostatic and hydrophobic bonds, but their relative parts are not known. Still not known how ATP causes myosin to dissociate, and what's the significance of the fact that each myosin has two heads. Well, those were a list of unknowns in 1974, still more or less unknown, and there are a lot more unknowns that have turned up. What fraction of heads are active at any one time in an isometric contraction? Estimates vary between about 15% and 50%. Is the attachment probability uniform anywhere within the actin helix, or does it vary within the actin helix? There is some evidence that from specialized muscles that it does vary. What's the origin of the rise of tension that occurred with a delay after a stretch, after the initial fall, and then there was that delay? It's the basis of the oscillation of asynchronous insect flight muscles. What is the amount of force from a single head? As I mentioned, different laboratories get values between 2 and 10 piconewtons. Again, what's the size of the stroke? And at the end of this article, I said, and I repeat it now, quite apart from the fact that all these things are unknown, the whole history of theories of muscular contraction during the last half century shows that even when a set of ideas seems to be well established, there's a large chance that it will be overthrown by some unexpected discovery. But there are good prospects. There certainly will be great improvements in existing techniques, notably the single molecule techniques, single fibers in which the surface membrane has been destroyed, make all sorts of experiments possible because you can change the chemical environment of the contractile material, but these fibers are rather irregular, they give rather poor tension, there's rather little early recovery. I'm sure there'll be great improvements in those respects, and great improvements in time-resolved X-ray work. And there are techniques that are just beginning to be used. These doubly attached probes that I've just mentioned, fluorescence from single molecules, a modified ATP that is fluorescent, and you can get it to do its, these tremendously ingenious experiments, notably by Yanagida and his group in Japan, and with the changes of fluorescence due to the ATP diffusing away, correlated with the tension steps, site-directed mutations within the actin, the myosin head or in the actin, only just beginning to produce significant results. And when the structures of actin and myosin were published, I thought a whole industry would develop almost immediately of doing theoretical calculations of the interactions between the two molecules. As far as I know, only one such paper has so far been published, and it's had really rather little attention, which has surprised me. And I'm sure there'll be techniques that we think of as little now as we thought of single molecule experiments 10 years ago. Well, I've filled my time, so I'll stop at that point, and thank you very much. And I must thank again the organizers of this meeting for giving me this opportunity to present, well, the way that muscles work, rather from the mechanical aspect. I've said very little about their chemistry, or about only in passing about structure, and largely based on single intact fibers. That's the kind of work that I've in fact been involved in myself. Well, thank you very, very much.